Hello and welcome to News Central Television. I am Lekon Onobanjo. Here are stories making headlines beyond the continent. The news begins in the United States, where the judge in Donald Trump's criminal hush money case has ordered that sentencing be delayed indefinitely. This is a legal win for the president-elect as he prepares to return to the White House. Trump was convicted of 34 felony counts in May after a jury found he had fraudulently manipulated business records to cover up an alleged sexual encounter with a porn star ahead of the 2016 election. Prosecutors argue that concealing the alleged tryst was intended to help him win his first run for the White House. Staying in the U.S., President-elect Donald Trump has named former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi as his new choice to run the Justice Department. This comes hours after his first pick to run the nation's top law enforcement agency, Matt Gaetz, dropped out. Gaetz stepped aside amid continued fallout over a federal sex trafficking investigation that cast doubt on his ability to be confirmed as the nation's chief federal law enforcement officer. Bondi has been an outspoken defender of Trump and was one of his lawyers during his first impeachment trial when he was accused, but was not convicted of abusing his power as he tried to condition U.S. military assistance to Ukraine on what a country investigating then former Vice President Joe Biden. Now, joining us on the news to discuss more on these appointments, how it would actually affect Africa, is an author and a senior specialist on humanitarian affairs, Professor Mukesh Kapila. Thank you so much, Professor Kapila, for joining us.
Glad to be here.
So how might the appointment of the hardline figures like, Tom Homan and Stephen Miller and the latest Bondi affects the migration patterns of Africans to the United States, especially in terms of asylum seeking and undocumented immigration?
I don't think the individual names of Trump nominees really matter because they're all being selected on the basis of their personal loyalty to him. This is what is different from his first administration. But in terms of your question about migration, the Trump view is been very clearly stated, and that is that he wants to minimize migration, and especially illegal or irregular migration. And that's why a number of measures are to be expected, which will make it very difficult for migrants to get into the United States. And for those who are there already, they may well find themselves on the way out. Now, as far as Africa is concerned, actually, while the numbers of irregular migrants from Africa have increased in recent years, they are really not particularly significant in terms of the total amount of migration into America. Nevertheless, I think they're going to get caught up in all of this. And then in terms of legal migration, that is those who are going for legitimate purposes, including seeking asylum, refugees from war zones and so on, I think it's going to be harder, much harder for them.
Okay, so when we talk about justice reforms, anti-corruption crusade, combating transnational crime, do you think the leadership of Pam Bondi would be willing to work with Africans along this line? Because the normal narrative has always been America first.
Well, I think precisely the Africa first policy means that they will work with anyone and any country in any continent that is going to be a good partner to them in advancing American interests. What that means is that they're not going to be looking at Africa as a continent as a whole. And I don't think the African Union, for example, as a multilateral organization, will be particularly effective or useful in speaking for the continent of Africa. It'll be individual countries that are going to have to build up bilateral relationships in any sector, be it justice, be it business, be it trade. And what that means is that Africans will need to be aware of a divide and rule environment that is going to possibly do competition within African countries. And I think if this means a tougher action on corruption which is very prevalent in Africa, then that is no bad thing. But overall, I think it's a bit mixed picture as to what's going to happen.
Okay, so how do you now think, African civil society organizations should be better prepared, or how can they prepare themselves when you look at the potential shifts in U.S. policy, most especially under Bondi's leadership? We're talking about strategies that might be employed that can help them advocate for better interests, of course, in the face of this new U.S. dispensation.
Well, we know that the Trump administration is not enamored, for example, of population-related policies like family planning, like HIV, like reproductive health. And generally speaking, I think you may expect its aid budget to be restricted. What that means is that African civil society organizations that are dependent on project funds, on grants from the American government through USAID and others, they will actually face hardship. And of course, if civil society organizations in Africa are involved in democracy and in human rights promotion, then I'm not sure that the Americans will be that much interested. But quite honestly, it is time that we had African civil society finding African solutions to African challenges and not constantly becoming donor dependent and being driven by the donors. So they should look upon this as an opportunity to come of age and stop looking to donors. And African civil society should be African grown and work according to African values and principles, not be dictated by the Americans or any other donors.
And you would expect, solutions to come by for vulnerable migrants from Africa who are probably currently facing mass deportation issues and discrimination in the U.S. Now, for those in that category, what would you advocate for them?
Well, it's important for African organizations, governments as well as civil society organizations, to build good alliances with progressive democratic, I don't mean Democratic Party, I mean democratic
solutions,
in a sort of sense, elements in the US, because so that when the legitimate rights of people of African origin are subverted, that they can stand up. I think one thing we do know about Trump is that if you stand up to him, it's hard, and but he also respects people who take a principled position, even if he disagrees with you. So the important thing is not to kowtow to him, not to just say what he wants, as some African governments are already starting to do. They're out-trumping Trump himself in terms of their trying to get close to him. And I think that would be an extremely wrong attitude, either for African governments or for African civil society organizations.
All right, Professor Mukesh Kapila, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. We appreciate that.
Thank you.
Away from that, we go to the Russia-Ukraine war, where President Vladimir Putin has sent a strong message to the West, saying that the prospect of further strikes depends on the actions of the United States and its allies. He had previously insisted that they reserve the right to strike countries who aid Ukraine with weapons to hit Russian territory after Ukraine fired US and UK supplied missiles at Russian territories for the first time. In his video message, Putin also warned the conflict had taken on elements of a global character and stressed Moscow was ready for whatever that may come in its confrontation with Kiev and the West. According to him, Russia had conducted a test launch of a new hypersonic intermediate-range missile aimed at the Ukrainian facilities in the country, which was fitted with a non-nuclear warhead. He mentioned that prior to future strikes, Moscow would warn civilians and advise citizens of friendly states to evacuate the danger zones, suggesting a potential nuclear contamination.
Испытания в боевых условиях ракетной системы «Орешник» проводятся нами в ответ на агрессивные действия стран НАТО в отношении России. Вопрос о дальнейшем развертывании ракет средней и меньшей дальности будет решаться нами в зависимости от действий США и их сателлитов. Объекты для поражения в ходе дальнейших испытаний наших новейших ракетных комплексов будут определяться нами, исходя из угроз безопасности Российской Федерации. Об этом рекомендую серьезно задуматься и правящим элитам тех стран, которые вынашивают планы использовать против России свои воинские контингенты. Разумеется, выбирая в случае необходимости и в качестве ответных мер объекты для поражения такими системами, как «Орешник» на территории Украины, мы будем заранее предлагать мирным жителям, а также просить находящихся там граждан дружественных государств покинуть опасные зоны. Будем делать это по гуманитарным соображениям. Открыто, публично, без опасения противодействия со стороны противника.
In the meantime, China has reiterated its calls for calm and restraints from all parties involved in the Ukraine conflict. This comes after Russia confirmed an experimental hypersonic ballistic missile launch. After the launch, Russian President Vladimir Putin stated that the situation in Ukraine had the characteristics of a global war, suggesting potential strikes on Western countries. In response, Beijing issued a call for tranquility. According to Li Jiang, a spokesperson for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, China has consistently maintained a neutral stance, advocating for the de-escalation of the conflict in Ukraine. Meanwhile, NATO and Ukraine will hold talks next week in Brussels over Russia's firing of an experimental hypersonic intermediate-range missile, diplomats said on Friday. Ambassadors from countries in the NATO-Ukraine Council will meet on Tuesday to discuss the strike on the city of Dnipro. Speaking ahead of the meeting, Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiga says his country hopes for concrete and meaningful outcomes.
Це серйозне масштабування війни, це серйозна ескалація російської агресії, це зростання ризиків для нашого цивільного населення і, безумовно, що це також серйозний виклик для спільної трансатлантичної безпеки. Тому ми повинні спільно також реагувати, маючи на увазі ось ці всі реалії. Тому засідання наступного тижня буде проведено у форматі Україна-НАТО, і ми сподіваємося на конкретні змістовні результати після його проведення.
We continue on beyond the continent in the Middle East, where Israel's military says it had killed 2 commanders involved in Hamas's October 7, 2023 attack, pressing its North Gaza offensive against what the International Criminal Court has done by issuing arrest warrants over the war. With Israel also fighting Hamas ally Hezbollah in Lebanon, footage showed several strikes early on Friday in Beirut's southern suburbs, where the Iran-backed group holds sway. The International Criminal Court on Thursday said that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant may bear criminal responsibility for the war crime of starvation as a method of warfare and other crimes against humanity against Palestinians in the besieged Gaza Strip. The Hague-based court's decision drew mixed reactions from world leaders, with some vowing to arrest the Israelis if they enter their country's territory.
5 دقايق طالع من بيتي بتطلع رايح شق على اختي بتطلع بلاقي انه اجى الصاروخ ببيتي ركضت لشوف شو في لقيت اصلا ما عاد في اثار بيت في جوره كثير كبيره وصرنا نلملم اشلاء على بعد مئات الامتار اشلاء كثير صغير عايش هون انا وزوجتي ومعي عندي 4 اولاد من ضمنهم بنت مقعده مش بس مقعده ما بتعرف تحكي ولا تمشي ولا شيء يعني بنت بس مسطحه بالارض هيدي اللي اجى الصاروخ بحرجه.
بيت مدنيه ما في لا عسكر ولا شيء وهذا البيت مدني وهذا البيت مدني وانا عم تجي عم تضرب بيوت المدنيه هون راح 6 شهداء وتحت بيت مدني كمان راح 6 شهداء كلها عم يجوا يضربوا على بيوت.
Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has accused the International Criminal Court of anti-Semitism. The Prime Minister said this in a video message, adding that ICC has lost its legitimacy as an international legal institution. This comes as a reaction to the ICC's arrest warrants against him and his former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. They are both accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity for Israel's actions in Gaza, using starvation as a method of warfare, as well as for crimes against humanity, including murder, persecution, and other inhumane acts. In response, Netanyahu said that the warrants would not stop Israel from defending itself when necessary. He insisted that the court was accusing Israel of fictitious crimes while overlooking the real war crimes being committed against Israel and many others.
בית הדין בהאג עושה נגד הפשעים האמיתיים נגד האנושות שמבוצעים במקומות רבים בעולם? גם כן כלום. מיליוני אזרחים חפים מפשע נרצחו או נעקרו מבתיהם באיראן, בסוריה, בתימן, במקומות נוספים. אבל במקום לפעול נגד משטרים אפלים אלה, בית הדין בחר לטפול האשמות שווא דווקא נגד מדינת ישראל. זהו צעד אנטישמי שיש לו מטרה אחת: להרתיע אותנו ממימוש זכותנו הטבעית להגן על עצמנו מול אויבים הקמים עלינו להשמידנו. שום החלטה אנטי-ישראלית מקוממת לא תמנע מאיתנו ולא תמנע ממני להמשיך להגן בכל דרך על המדינה שלנו. לא ניכנע ללחצים.
Still on the development, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, whose country holds the EU's rotating presidency, says it would invite Israeli counterpart Benjamin Netanyahu to visit and defy an ICC arrest warrant. Orban is one of Israel's closest partners in the EU's 27-country bloc. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Friday thanked his Hungarian counterpart for what he described as his show of moral clarity after inviting him to visit despite the arrest warrant.
Tehát itt nincsen más választás, hanem szembe kell szegülni ezzel a döntéssel. Úgyhogy én még a mai nap során meg is fogom hívni az izraeliek miniszterelnökét, Netanyahu urat egy magyarországi látogatásra, ahol a meghívásban garantálni fogom a számára, hogyha eljön, akkor a Nemzetközi Büntetőbíróság ítéletének semmilyen hatálya nem lesz Magyarország. Most egy dolog, hogy fölháborítóan pimasz, mondhatnám cinikus döntés az, amit a Nemzetközi Büntetőbíróság hozott, hogy egy folyamatban lévő konfliktus, mert hogy a Közel-Keleten ez nem zárult le, egy folyamatban lévő konfliktusba avatkozik be, jogi köntösbe öltözve, de valójában politikai célokból. Ez önmagában helytelen, a nemzetközi jog gyakorlatilag teljes lejáratását eredményezi, de ráadásul még olaj is lehet a tűz.
Activists linked to the Extinction Rebellion environmental group dumped a truckload of manure outside Italy's Interior Ministry in Rome on Friday as part of a demonstration. Around 100 protesters set up tents on the grounds of the ministry building in Piazza del Viminali near Rome's Opera House before being removed by the police. The protest was against the Italian government's climate policies and the promotion of laws aimed at repressing dissent, according to news outlets in the country. The demonstration coincided with the final day of the UN Climate Change Conference, COP29, in Baku, Azerbaijan. Earlier this year, Italy introduced tough new penalties for those who damage or deface monuments and heritage sites, as the right-wing government sought to clamp down on eco-vandals. We also tell you that wealthy nations have offered $250 billion a year to help poorer nations hit hardest by global warming, but faced immediate calls led by Africa to give more as UN climate negotiations extended into overtime. At the COP29 talks in Azerbaijan, developing nations are demanding a bigger commitment from historic polluters most responsible for warming, but rich countries insist that massive financial pledges are not politically realistic. And a draft text revealed hours before 2 weeks of fraught bargaining were set to end, Azerbaijan said wealthy nations had committed to providing $250 billion a year by the year 2035. However, COP29 lead negotiator Yalchin Rafiev said negotiations would press on and that the $250 billion does not correspond to fair and ambitious goals.
Dear colleagues, good afternoon. As you know, since the beginning of this year, Azerbaijan COP29 presidency has been pushing for a more fair and ambitious outcome of the COP29, the fair ambitious NCQG. that takes into account needs and priorities of the developing country parties. Today we have published a streamlined package of the draft decisions, and that includes also a $250 billion goal by the developed countries. We will continue to work with the parties to make the final adjustments to those issues that are still outstanding.
And I'll tell you that Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva says he's grateful to be alive after an alleged coup plot to prevent him and Vice President Geraldo Alckmin from taking office. Brazilian police have called for the indictment of ex-President Jair Bolsonaro over a 2022 coup plot to prevent current leader Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva from taking office. A police statement said its investigators had concluded that Bolsonaro and 36 others were planning the violent overthrow of the democratic state.
Depois eu sou um cara que eu tenho que agradecer agora muito mais porque eu estou vivo. A tentativa de me envenenar, eu e o Alckmin não deu certo, nós estamos aqui. É esse país, companheiros, sem perseguição. É esse país sem o estímulo do ódio. É esse país sem o estímulo da desavença que a gente precisa construir. E eu não quero envenenar ninguém. Eu não quero nem perseguir ninguém. A única coisa que eu quero é que quando terminar o meu mandato, a gente desmoralize com números.
And that's all on Beyond the Continent at this hour. Don't forget to watch us live on DSTV channel 422, Star Times, channel 274, Avo TV, and YouTube. Many thanks for watching. I am Lekon Onobanjo.